so that we get through a wonderful set of talks this afternoon. We will get started in a timely fashion. And I am extremely honored that we have Elizabeth Crone here from the University of California, Davis. And she will talk to us about masting in forest trees and beyond. How much is predictable and why?
Thank you. And thank you all for inviting me to be part of this symposium. So today, I'm going to talk about masting in communities and sort of to introduce the part of our session that's really more strictly about mast seeding. And so just to start it, I think we all know, but the definition of mast seeding or masting is synchronous episodic reproduction. And if you look at something like these red oaks in the northeastern US, where I lived until about 9 months ago, there are years when the ground is covered with acorns and years when it's not. And if you think about it, you could replot this as a time series like this, where on the x-axis we have years, on the y-axis we have the number of red acorns. These data happen to have been counted by a colleague of mine in Pennsylvania. And what you see is that there are, let's see if I can do this, there are years with very low seed production and a few years with very high seed production. So, and we're all familiar with this in forest trees like conifers and oaks and beeches, but this actually happens in all kinds of plant species. Here are some of the less famous plant species from the southern hardwood forests of the US where I grew up. Tupelo, tulip tree, mountain laurel, and rhododendron, both understory shrubs. And you can see in these species, there's also very erratic seed production, not that different from oaks and beeches. Masting is also, at least in my research career, conceptually related to alternate bearing in crop plants. So here are graphs of national level yields of 4 crops: apricots in Spain, coffee in Brazil, pistachios in the United States, mostly grown in California where I live now, and tangerines in Japan. And in all of them, you can see what looks a heck of a lot like alternate year reproduction or mast seeding. I'll just add that these circles, which are a relic of the paper that this data come from, are reported. A colleague of mine went through the agricultural literature for national level shocks being reported, and it's interesting that they're all low on this summary data, but it's also interesting that they're all in years where you would have expected, or almost all in years where you would have expected a drop anyway, just due to the dynamics of alternate bearing. So why do plants do this? Well, you've probably already heard this before, but just in case, one of the reasons mast seeding happens is because synchronous reproduction increases fitness, which we, possibly coined by Dave Kelly, call economies of scale, meaning when it happens at large scale, it's more advantageous to individual trees. So synchronous reproduction increases pollination efficiency, especially for species like oaks and conifers that have pollen blown in the wind. It's natural that if more plants are making pollen and flowers, well, apologies to the conifer plant nerds, at once, then pollination is more likely to happen. Seed production also satiates seed predators, both little predators, pre-dispersal, like the acorn weevil shown here, and potentially larger seed predators. And it can also turn granivores into dispersers, so seed caching animals, like the Clark's nutcracker, the jay shown here, or some mice and chipmunks, will eat all the seeds they collect in a low seed year, but will overcache and effectively plant. They're not just dispersers, they're farmers in high seed years. So this is in a broad sense why it happens, and we're gonna look in a little bit more detail at these mechanisms as the talk continues. First, I'm gonna give you some background that takes these economies of scale and translates them into some predictions about global patterns of variation in seed production. Then I'm going to say, do we see the same patterns in orchard crops like the ones I've showed you before? I should have mentioned that alternate bearing in orchard crops is bad for farmers. Nobody wants to have, actually, I'm just going to go back because I meant to say this and I'm so excited to be here that I forgot. Like, nobody wants this to happen if you're a farmer, right? What a farmer wants is predictable, constant yield, Also, at least for some of these crops, if I think absence of evidence is only absence of evidence, not evidence of absence, but at least for some of these crops, if not all of them, prices are lower in these high yield years than in the low yield years. So how frustrating to a farmer, you've got the most of the crop at the time when you're getting the least money for it. So this is something people have tried to breed out of plant species for a long time. So the second thing is, do we see the same patterns in orchard crops even though people have been trying for generations to breed it out of them? And then a little bit of analysis, do we see the same patterns in plant communities, and some lessons for predicting future seed production, since that's the spirit of this symposium. So first, global patterns of variation in seed production. And so for almost 30 years now, people have been making predictions that if massed seeding increases pollination efficiency, then the rationale is that wind-pollinated plant species should be more variable in their seed production than animal-pollinated species. And this is really flower production, but mostly we have data on seeds. Because, as I just mentioned, if you have your pollen blowing in the wind, like this willow, can I get it? There it is, this willow, then there's an obvious economy of scale. But for something that's insect-pollinated, like this coffee plant being visited by a carpenter bee, it's less obvious, because maybe the carpenter bee can fly a long distance and find 4 isolated coffee plants flowering in a forest. The second, and so 3 people who, a co-author of each of these papers, at least one, is in this room, but I'll look at 3 previous analyses, none done by me, of global patterns of mass seeding. And the first was done by Dave Kelly, who will close this section, and Veronica Sork nearly 20 years ago. And they compared the coefficient of variation, that's a measure of variability in seed production, between biotic, that's like insect-pollinated plants, and abiotic plants, and they find exactly what's predicted, higher variability in abiotic, like wind-pollinated plants. There was another review 18 years later by Ian Pierce, who's here, and colleagues, that compared the coefficient of variation of a larger data set of plants, and they found the same thing. Higher variability in wind-pollinated plants than animal-pollinated plants. And in press, I happened to get a copy of a paper by Q et al. That's accepted and in press in Nature Plants. I wonder if I'm in trouble for showing this result, but they told me I could. Where they measured variability a little bit differently, and they report their little results a little differently as the difference between one group and the other, but they see exactly the same thing, abiotic minus, it's animal minus abiotic. I think I did this wrong throughout, but a negative number means animal-pollinated species are less variable. So 3 people have looked at this over the years. It seems to always hold. Yes. The next prediction is that if masting leads to predator satiation, to satiation of seed predators, then species that are frugivore dispersed are less variable than predator or abiotic dispersed species. So digestion and pooping improves germination in most fleshy fruited species. So those species being eaten is not necessarily bad. It might be good to be eaten by a bird. Whereas in species like squirrels and other consumers, they might under certain, in fact, they're the ones that could be converted from consumers to dispersers in massed years. So species that are potentially dispersed by predators, species that make nuts, essentially, should be more variable. And then wind-dispersed species, you could argue, could go either way. Most people say those should be potentially variable because of predispersal seed predators. But if you're trying to attract frugivores, being variable might not be beneficial. So do other people find this? Going back to the same 3 reviews, here's Kelly and Sork, and you can see that predator-dispersed species are more variable than frugivore or wind-dispersed species. Ian Pierce's analysis, predator-dispersed species and abiotic-dispersed species are more variable than frugivore-dispersed species in the middle. And in the recent analysis by Q et al., it's a negative number, and I think I wrote this in the wrong direction on the y-axis, but that means that animal dispersed species are less variable than other ones. Once again, general theory works. The third prediction, which I first read in Ian's paper, although I think others had talked about it, and it's a pattern people have noticed, is that if masting increases pollination efficiency or predator satiation, then polar latitudes should have more variable seed production than equatorial ones. Or since we're all in the northern hemisphere, we can say northern more variable than southern. And the reason for this is that in tropical forests that are warmer, you have a lot more animal pollinated species because it's often too humid for wind pollination to be affected. You also have a lot more frugivore dispersed species, I'm not really sure why, and you have higher diversity, which means that any one species benefits less from alternate bearing because there's other species in the community that could support these frugivore communities. When you get to boreal, polar latitudes, you have very monospecific 1 or 2 species in forests, and you also tend to have wind-pollinated species and granivore dispersed species, so predator-eaten species. And intermediate latitudes tend to be in the middle, so we would expect to see this gradient of less variable in the south to more variable in the north. And more or less, we do. This is the result from Dave's study, where we have latitude on the x-axis and variability on the y-axis, and at least up to moderate northern latitudes like 45 degrees north. That's almost the top of the United States, top in a northern sense. You have an increase in variability with latitude. And I should say all of these graphs have the absolute value of latitude on the x-axis, so it's going from equatorial to polar. We see the same thing with maybe a slightly steeper drop-off at northern latitudes in Ian Pierce's study. And in the Q et al. Study, what they used was temperature rather than latitude as a predictor. But this number now means that warmer temperatures, or this bar, tend to have less variable seed production. So we have at least modest statistical support for this prediction across studies. So in general, when we look at global patterns of variation in seed production, we have surprisingly predictable patterns across different studies. Seed production is more variable in wind-pollinated species, it's less variable in frugivore dispersed species, and it tends to be more variable in the north. So, do we see the same patterns in orchard crops? Well, these are data that I did. I want to acknowledge my collaborators. In particular, I want to acknowledge Colin Oriens, a colleague of mine from when I was at Tufts University, which was up until a year ago, and Gabriela Garcia, who's shown to his, oh, let me get this right from your perspective, who were interested in coffee plantations, and in her first year of grad school, Gabriela interviewed farmers about what their biggest concerns were in terms of climate and coffee, and 35 out of 35 said alternate bearing. And Colin said, I have a colleague who knows about that. And they both drew me into thinking about agricultural crops, and were also very open to thinking about theories of massed seeding instead of traditional agroecology. And this is a photo from when they brought me and some others from my lab group down to a coffee farm where they work in Costa Rica. So, but what I'll talk to you about is not coffee in particular, but this global analysis we did, collecting data from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, which stores data for crops, all kinds of crops. We selected only ones that were reported in the literature to be alternate bearing, which we could go back and get data for all the crops, even the ones they've thought they've bred it out of or maybe never had it. But it was a total of 27 crops in 71 countries with time series at the national level from 1961 to 2018. We detrended them because yield of all crops is generally increasing through time, and then we're using this coefficient of variation at national scales as our metric of masting. And I just have the dots in the middle of each country, but some are averaged over all of Canada or all of Russia, although it might not grow everywhere in that country. So if masting increases pollination efficiency, wind-pollinated crops should be more variable than animal-pollinated crops. This is a graph of the coefficient of variation of these detrended time series, and insect-pollinated crops are, in fact, less variable even at the national scale. than wind-pollinated crops. If masting increases predator satiation, then frugivore dispersed crops should be less variable than predator or abiotically dispersed crops. So I divided them into fruits and seeds, which would have historically, I mean, now we eat them all, but historically been frugivore or predator dispersed, and it's not a statistically significant difference, but the seed is a little bit more variable. And so, yeah, modest support for this prediction. And if masting is increasing pollination efficiency or predator satiation, plants at polar latitudes should be more variable than equatorial. This geography is only the centroid latitude of each country. And yet, if we plot each country's seed production versus the centroid latitude of that country, crops in northern latitudes are more variable in production than crops in southern latitudes. So, yes, that prediction holds even across all crops at national levels. So, alternate bearing crops show mostly the same patterns as masting and wild plants, in spite of many efforts to breed out alternate bearing from these crops. I don't know why. Maybe there's some very strong evolutionary legacy we haven't been able to control. You could think of that as physiological constraints to the process of flowering. I should say, for those of you who are orchard producers in this room, if any of you are, you can control them by spraying plant hormones on them to make them flower every year, or by hand picking them to try to even out the high years and potentially balance out the low years. But we can see from these data that in spite of the fact that farmers care about it, they can very rarely put that much work into it. So one caution here as an aside, again, for anyone who works on an orchard crops, is that I also spend part of my time working with people who are interested in pollinator conservation. And one caution is that maximizing pollination and yield in one year could exaggerate alternate bearing in other years by making the high years higher and potentially the low years lower. But since I only have a limited amount of time, I should get on to, do we see the same patterns in plant communities? And these data are data that I analyzed as part of a working group of people working with data on the United States Long-Term Ecological Research Network, so back to wild plants. And I want to particularly acknowledge Diana Macias, who is the lead author of, this is what we call the simple metrics paper from our working group. Do these data also show the same patterns in all other plants? How many of you can see Ian in this picture? I also want to acknowledge the group leaders, Jeline and Miranda, and then the members of our simple metrics subgroup. So, here's a picture of the US Long-Term Ecological Research Network. It's very American. Not all the sites collect the same data. So 9 of these sites have long-term seed data. And these are a heterogeneous mix of 3 survey methods: seeds and traps, timed counts where people look up at trees, or tree-level censuses where people try to count all the cones on a conifer. These are species-level identifications, so some of the genera here, including oaks, most notably, and hickories, are not included in this analysis because they're not identified to species. We have 103 species with 1 to 62 species per site, a mean of 12. Population level time series, there's 29 plots or climatologically different sites across the 9 LTER sites. 232 time series, and 10 to 59 years, because this is the US and nothing is done the same way at every site. So here's a picture of the 9 sites that we have data. Here the circles are the area is proportional to the number of time series. The colors reflect the different species. There's differences in variability across the 9 sites. Let's look at some potential predictors. And these are the same predictors we've looked at so far. If masting increases pollination efficiency, wind pollination should be more variable than animal pollination. Here it is, animal. The dots are each population. The big black dots are the means and confidence intervals. So the wind-pollinated species are more variable than the animal-pollinated species when we throw them all in one hat. Yay. If masting increases predator satiation, the frugivore dispersed in the middle should be less variable than predator or abiotic dispersed. We see it, yay. If masting increases pollination efficiency or predator satiation, polar latitudes should be more variable than equatorial. Here's a linear regression. It wasn't quadratic in our data, but The pattern holds. I could stop here, and I only have about 10 minutes left, and we could say there are global rules of mass seeding that apply even when we've tried to breed it out, even when we add this data set with a bunch of tropical species. But I'm going to moderate that conclusion with one thing that we noticed almost accidentally in our working group. And we noticed that these traits that we're interested in predicting, that pollination syndrome and dispersal syndrome, are not randomly distributed among sites. In fact, we expect southern latitudes to have, like Luquillo, this tropical site in Puerto Rico, to have different kinds of species than northern latitudes, like Bonanza BNZ, which is up in Alaska. So, in fact, there's only one site that has a significant number of both animal and wind-pollinated species. And there's only 2 sites that have a significant number of abiotic and frugivore dispersed species, and no site had more than 3 predator dispersed species and more than 3 dispersed with any other mechanism. So let's look at what happens. You know, there's a lot of things that vary among the sites. Let's look at what happens within sites. So first we'll start with pollination syndrome. The only site we could do this at is Luquillo in South Carolina. And here's a graph with pollination syndrome, all the different populations and their means. And what you can see is the opposite prediction from the global pattern. At KIOES, it's actually not significant at the 0.05 level, but if anything, wind-pollinated species are less variable than animal-pollinated species. We actually excluded oaks and hickories, which are famous masting species, because they were only at the genus level. So here's data for them at the genus level, and they're right down there with the other wind-pollinated species. So wind pollination is common where masting is common. That's true. But wind pollination is not more variable in seed production than animal pollinated species where they both occur, at least not at this one site. So our prediction didn't hold. What about the frugivore dispersal? Well, we have 2 sites. KIOES and Luquillo are 2 of our more southern sites at which we could test this. Again, on the x-axis, we have abiotic and frugivore dispersed. We have the means for each site. There was no significant interaction or different among the sites. And once again, at these sites, the frugivore dispersed species are more variable than species with abiotic dispersal. So frugivore dispersal is common where masting is uncommon, or at least where seed production is less variable at the southern sites, at least in the neotropics this pattern holds. But frugivory does not lead to at least is not associated with less variable seed production at sites where they both occur. Okay. Are we brave enough to test the third prediction? Well, I was. So if masting increases pollination efficiency or predator satiation, polar latitudes, that's bigger numbers, should be more variable than equatorial latitudes, that's smaller numbers. And these are only 4 species, sugar maples, which are near and dear to my heart, that go on the east coast of the US, from New England at the higher latitudes to South Carolina at the lower latitudes, and some conifers that occur in the set of sites in the western US. And on average, there's the opposite of the global pattern with these species. All of these slopes are negative except one that's kind of flat. There's less variation in the north within a species in its range. And maybe this reflects stressful conditions at the warmer range limits. I know for sugar maple, which I know well, that we're really capturing its southern range limit in South Carolina, but it goes way north into Canada in the eastern US. And maybe there's low background community variation at this scale, so in this case, there's less reason to expect a within species than a global species pattern. But prediction not met. So, what we learn from these plant communities at these long-term ecological research sites in the US is that they show this canonical global pattern at continental scales when we throw all species in one hat. But they show the opposite patterns within sites and species. And this really and so there's no evidence for sort of local adaptation in the expected direction within species. It's really hard to distinguish the importance of possible causes because we only had one site where we could look at within-site variation in pollinators, 2 sites, the 2 southern ones, which some people would say are the least masty, although there's a lot of masting species at KIOES, but the tropical one, and there's masting tropical species too, so maybe they're, anyway, hard to distinguish the importance of possible causes. So, what are some lessons that we've learned in this talk? The general conclusions that I will give you are, first, there are these universal patterns of masting. The global patterns are surprisingly consistent. Increased variation of wind-pollinated species, decreased variation of frugivore dispersed species, and increased variation at least at mid, if not northern latitudes. Masting is also hard to get rid of. We learned that from the crop plants. But the causes remain a bit mysterious, even for these well-established global patterns, because we don't see the same patterns always within sites. So, future research directions, it would be great to have more studies looking at variation among species where we have single sites with lots of trait variation. And maybe some of these more obscure understory species in forests could give us that comparison. It would also be great to look more at variation among sites where we have species capturing their climate limits and their range limits, and see if we see this relationship going from north to south in a more sensible way. And I also want to say there's a lot of potential for studying orchard crops, which are planted in a lot of different places. There must be other time series, you know, that we could get by working with farmers. So I really am almost, okay, anyway. And the general importance of seed in reproduction and forest ecology, you all probably know about. And so, finally, before I run out of time, to plan for future forests, I want to say that the patterns we see are easier to explain than predict. And if we're thinking about changes in species, if interactions are driving a lot of this, many species will be changing at once. Pollinators, seed predators, seed dispersers, the community context they're in. And so we should expect the unexpected. Even if we're carefully managing for the dominant species in a forest, the rest of the community is going to be changing in ways that might affect the behavior and fitness consequences of it. And you know, that's scary. I mean, expect the unexpected almost means we can't plan, but I think it means we can plan for resilience. And we can plan for things to be changing in ways we don't expect and watching for them and responding to them as they occur. So with that, I will thank you all, I will thank my collaborators, and I just thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you so much. That was shocking in some ways, but in the best way. We have time for one quick question before we move on, but a quick question. Okay, Georg.
Okay, if nobody else. Well, thanks, really, very, very inspiring. On this global comparison of the coefficient of variation in terms of wind pollination and frugivory, you know, there was this recent paper in the New Phytologist that looked at the evolution of pollination syndromes in angiosperms that found that the original pollination mode was actually insect pollination. So don't you think that, or could it be that the distribution simply mirrors the distribution of angiosperms and gymnosperms?
I think our data set for crop plants includes no gymnosperms. There might be a palm, but the fact that that makes it even more surprising that we see it in crop plants.
All right, unfortunately we have to move on here, but lots to discuss afterwards, I'm sure. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Next, I'm very honored to introduce Professor Akiko Satake from Kyushu University in Fukuoka, Japan. And she will talk about molecular phenology governing flowering and fruiting dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you very much for kind introduction. So it's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much for invitation. I'm so excited to talk about our recent study here. That is, first I want to introduce Asian, very pretty forest ecosystem, and my talk is focusing on very molecular level, molecular genetic aspect of forest tree reproduction. Okay, so you know Japan. I am from south part in Japan that is called Kyushu. So in this region, we have beautiful laurel forest dominated by trees that are evergreen tree in the family Fagaceae. And these trees produce pretty acorn like this. And I think most of you know the season of acorn production. So when, in which season acorn produced? So that is fall, of course. So in Japan, we have 22 Fagaceae species, and all of them produce acorn in fall. So how about the flowering season? So out of 22 species, 21 species flower in spring. And some are animal pollinated and some are wind pollinated. Okay? But we have only one species that flower in fall, that is Lithocarpus glabra. You can see pretty flower, but also you can see the, here, acorn here. So because the season of acorn production is also fall. So in this species, acorn mature when they are flowering, okay? So have you ever think about how long does it take from flowering to fruiting? The period from flowering to fruiting. Okay, so these species flower in spring and fruit in fall. So the period from flowering to fruiting is about 6 months. So these species are called one-year fruiting species. But there are species that flower in spring, but they don't produce acorn in the same year of flowering. For example, this is example, Lithocarpus edulis. They flower in spring and produce the inflorescence, including multiple female flower. And in fall and winter, nothing happens within this flower. They are almost sleeping, dormant. But next year, after winter, they awake and fruits start developing and fruit produced in the fall of the next year of flowering. So these species are called two-year fruiting species, and majority of species in Japan are two-year fruiting. So this is two examples. The left panel is Quercus actissima, and the right panel is Castanopsis siboldi. So you can find very tiny female flowers that are produced this year, but you also find the fruits developing from flower produced a year ago. So flower and fruits are present in the same tree at the same time. So this is two-year fruiting species. So I'm very interested why they do this, why they wait so long to produce acorn. That is very interesting. So I think there are two possible mechanisms. So this is a male flower of Lithocarpus edulis, and this is female flower. So male flower produce pollen. So pollination happens right after flowering. And in two-year fruiting species, more than 1 year they need to mature acorn. So one possibility is that, so right after pollination, the fertilization happens, but acorn development is very slow. Okay, so this is one possibility. And another possibility is that they wait long to fertilize the ovule. And after fertilization, the acorn develop relatively quickly. So this is second possibility. So which is more likely? Can you raise your hand if you think this is more likely? Slow development of acorn. Okay, Elizabeth. But only 3. So most of the people think this is more likely? So I will, okay. So you will know the answer in later part of my talk, okay? So Fagaceae includes 8 genera and more about 1,000 species, okay? And KIOES would be most familiar for you. So because this genus distributes widely in the world, including Europe, North America, Central America, and also Asia. But Lithocarpus and Castanopsis are exclusive to Asia. And we collected flowering and fruiting data in diverse species in Fagaceae and found interesting relationship between the percentage of 2-year fruiting species and the genus. So we found that Lithocarpus and Castanopsis, both are animal pollinated genera, include a lot of 2-year fruiting species. 92% and 82% are 2-year fruiting species. But in wind-pollinated genera, KIOES, only 38% are 2-year fruiting. So this is the flowering and fruiting data we collected from the species in China. It includes 4 genera, Lithocarpus, Castanopsis, KIOES, okay, 5 genera, Castania and Fagus. And so this axis, you can see species, and here the months in year T and T+1. So in Lithocarpus, the flowering time is quite diverse across species. So some species flower in spring, but some species flower in autumn. But fruiting time is highly synchronized across species, and the majority of species are 2-year fruiting in Lithocarpus and Castanopsis. But in KIOES, many species are 1-year fruiting, and in Castania and Fagus, all of species are 1-year fruiting. That's interesting. So I'm very interested in what is the underlying mechanism of 2-year fruiting. So it's not well known about the mechanism, but the recent progress in the field of molecular phenology can provide a new venue to explore the molecular mechanism of 2-year fruiting. So phenology is the nature's calendar. Yeah? So we Japanese are very looking forward to the season of cherry blossom in spring. And in summer, school children grow morning glory during holiday. And in autumn, we enjoy beautiful flower of spider lily along paddy field. And winter, camellia start flowering. So even without a calendar, we can feel the season by seeing which species are flowering. So this seasonal activity of natural organism is phenology. And molecular phenology represents a conceptual advancement of phenology. So there are diverse, a lot of species in the world. And different species have orthologous genes that have evolved from common ancestral gene. And each gene would have some specific expression pattern in response to environmental change. And if we monitor the expression pattern, the molecular phenology in different species, and compare them across species, we can understand in which season which genes are expressed, and what genes are responsible for the different phenological response across species. So molecular phenology can transform the concept of phenology from observable to unobservable, more dynamic response to environmental change. So in this talk, I would like to introduce our recent study about comparative molecular phenology. So we used 2 species. One is the one-year fruiting species, Quercus glauca, that is evergreen wind-pollinated species. And another is 2-year fruiting species, that is Lithocarpus edulis, also evergreen, but animal-pollinated species. So in these 2 species, we collected leaves and birds from 3 individuals for 2 years for each species. And then we extracted RNA and performed RNA sequence and microarray and obtained the gene expression data of orthologus gene. So 7,707 orthologus gene. So this data enable us to perform pairwise comparison of orthologus gene expression pattern. Okay? And this is the data for molecular phenology in 1- and 2-year fruiting species. So our molecular phenology data show clear seasonality of gene expression profile. And depending on the similarity of expression profile, we find 4 distinct clusters. In the first cluster, that includes 25% of gene, the expression level is very high, only in winter. Here. In both species, expression is high only in winter. In the second cluster, the expression is high in spring and also through minor peak in fall. And the third cluster, that includes 27% of gene, expression is highly expressed in summer. So these 3 clusters reveal very conserved gene expression regardless of species. But we also found the differential expression profile. That is this cluster. So for example, here in 1-year fruiting species, expression level is high in summer, but in 2-year fruiting species, it is high in winter. So the peak is very different between 2 species. So what kind of function of the gene included in each cluster? So we characterize the function of gene for each cluster and found that in spring and fall, when flowering and fruiting happens, the gene associated with cell cycle and cell division are included. So which means the cell proliferation is occurring very frequently in spring and fall. And in summer, when the heat and drought stress is severe, a lot of genes involved in heat stress and loss stress are expressed. That really makes sense. And in winter, genes associated for acclimation to low temperature and tolerance to freezing are highly expressed. So this means that the growth and stress responses are necessary for plant survival, regardless of species. So these are very conserved gene expression profile between species. Okay? So how about the gene exhibiting differential expression between species? And we found that these genes associated with reproduction, in particular, pollen acceptance and acquisition of female gametophyte identity. So you can see the blue line are the data from, the red line are data from 1-year fruiting species. So expression level is high in summer in these species. But when we look at 2-year fruiting species, these genes are activated in winter, not in summer. So the activation timing is delayed compared to 1-year fruiting species. So this means that, I think, the female gametophyte is ready in summer in 1-year fruiting species, but in 2-year fruiting species, female gametophyte is ready after winter. So the timing of the ovule development would be different between these two species. So for me, this result is very interesting because it suggests something interesting about the relationship between pollen and ovule ongoing. And in angiosperm, so many species complete fertilization after pollination within 2 days, very quickly. But our data suggests that the 2-year fruiting species may postpone fertilization until next spring. So to test this hypothesis, we observed the transverse section of ovule using confocal microscopy. And indeed, we found the ovule development is very slow in 2-year fruiting species. So pollination happens in June in 2-year fruiting species, Zocarpus aetris. But even in November, so this is an image of ovule, and in November, so ovule are still immature, right? But in March, the ovule start developing after winter in March. And in May, ovule are fully developed. And you can see 6 mature embryo sacs here. And in June, 1 of ovule is finally fertilized. So this circle is a young embryo, just fertilized. So this means that after pollination, it takes 1 year to fertilize the ovule. So very long delay fertilization. So answer to the question I made is this. So 2-year fruiting species delay fertilization for 1 year. So what happened in 1-year fruiting species? We performed the same analysis and found that in 1-year fruiting species, ovule become fully matured within 2 months after flowering, so very quick, and no requirement of winter cold. So I think 2-year fruiting species start developing ovule after winter. So we hypothesize that the exposure to winter cold is necessary for them to start developing ovule. So something interesting happening between the interaction of between male and female. And we think in 2-year fruiting species, male are very patient to fertilize the female that develop very slowly, right? So now to explore the interaction between male and female, we are currently doing pollen tube imaging together with the student Takenori Shagawa. And he found that right after pollination, pollen germinate, but pollen tube growth stops somewhere in the style around winter. But after winter, the pollen tube start again and then fertilize ovule. So the control of the pollen tube growth, somehow the pollen tube growth is controlled by female side, but we hypothesize. But still, the detailed process is not well understood. So we are working together with students to explore this interaction more. And also we are interested in how the pollen tube growth and ovule development is influenced by temperature, especially cold temperature. Because if the 2-year fruiting require winter cold to develop ovule, the climate change would have a significant impact on fertilization success. So fertilization may be suppressed and that impair the seed production. That is a big issue. But we also know that there are many tropical Fukuoka species, in particular in Southeast Asia, the rich diversity of Fukuoka species. And this picture, acorn and flower of Lithocarpus species. So in tropics, there are no winter, but they can produce acorn and flower. So they don't need winter cold. So do tropical Fukuoka species show delayed fertilization? We don't know, but we are currently analyzing the data collected in tropical Fukuoka species, and our tentative analysis showed they don't delay fertilization. So because Fukuoka species diverged about 50 million years ago, the climate was very warm compared to the present. So I think they evolved the requirement of winter cold during they distribute to the northern part. So to explore the evolutionary history, I think the more further study is needed in future. Okay, so in conclusion, our study highlights the value of molecular phenology as a powerful tool to unravel the dynamic response of plant species to environmental change. So we are dedicating to advance this new field by undertaking genome project in Fukuoka and also conducting large-scale monitoring of molecular phenology from temperate to tropical moist forest ecosystem. So this is very new field and just started. So if you are interested in, please visit our field. Okay, so this is all of my talk, and I always enjoying working with my wonderful collaborator and also the member of our laboratory. And thank you very much for all of you for your attention. Thank you very much. So this is all of my talk.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm sure there are some questions. Yes.
Do any of the Fukuoka species in Japan produce both 1- and 2-year flowers, which I think is the case for Quercus suber in Europe, and also in some hybrid oaks in California? Do you have some that do both in Japan like this?
Quercus suber, we don't have that species in Japan.
But I guess do any of the Lithocarpus or Quercus have both flowers that are 1 year and also flowers that are 2 year?
Okay, yes. So in Lithocarpus and Castamopsis, Asian species, they are not so flexible. They are 2-year fruiting species. I never seen the same species show 1 year and 2-year fruiting phenotype. I think that is different from Quercus suber. Quercus suber, depending on the region, some individuals show 1 year fruiting type, and the southern part, I think they are 1 year fruiting type, but northern district, the 1 year fruiting type. So depending on the region, the 1 year of fruiting different. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Akiko. This was such an exciting talk. So if this fertilization is just so much delight and the acorns have just so little time to grow, so in the end, what are your ideas? What's the fitness advantage of this strategy? Why they wait 2 years?
Yes. So together with Dave, we wrote a paper about explaining adaptive reason for 2-year fruiting. That is the postpone of the fruit development to next spring. So we found that the many species that flower late of the season are 2-year fruiting species. That means that they want to avoid the winter to develop fruit, and they postpone the fertilization until next spring. And next spring, the environment is, good for developing acorn. So I think avoidance of the winter would be the one explanation for adaptive reason.
Thank you, that's great, thank you.
So just to follow up on that question, and then I have a second question, but to follow up, do you think that the late flowering of the 2-year species, they're also animal pollinated? Is that coincident with the phenology of the insect pollinators? Is that why, so they flower late? I'm making up a story, and you can tell me if it's true. They flower late because that's the time of year when their pollinators are out.
Yes.
And then they don't have time to finish developing their seeds. Is that how it works? Or?
Yes. In animal pollinated species, our analysis of the flowering time data show flowering time are not synchronized in animal pollinated species. Some species flower in earlier part, and some species flower in the later part of the season. So I think that means there is some evolutionary the driver to split the flowering time to avoid the competition over pollinator, for example. That's why the flowering time is diverse. And okay, so there are species that flower in late part of the season, and for that species, fertilization in autumn is not adaptive because cold winter is waiting. So they postpone the fertilization until next spring. So that is our hypothesis. Mm-hmm.
And very quickly, my simple question, are the animal pollinated species more or less variable than the wind pollinated species?
At least for 2 species I introduced today, both species are not so variable. So wind pollinated and animal pollinated, they every year they flower and every year they produce a lot of acorn. So at least for 2 species, I think maybe not so different. Mm-hmm.
I also have a question about the acorn development and size in the 2-year species. From my limited experience with 2-year species, they tend to have high tannin, large acorns. At least tan oaks have pretty large acorns compared to some of the 1-year species. So do you think it's a consequence or a driver? Do they save up, or do they just now have more time and then they can grow a bigger acorn?
Right, so that's a difficult question to answer. It can be consequence or a driver, because if they can quickly develop acorn, they don't need to postpone the fertilization time. But I think they already have big acorn. They cannot quickly develop until the winter starts. So that they, I think, evolved to postpone the fertilization timing.
Because it makes me wonder if, investing into defenses, let's say you're in an area where you have strong seed predation, and you thus need a high tannin acorn, it may make sense to delay your fructification, your actual growing of the seed until next year, where you can invest more into tannins as well.
That's interesting.
Okay, I will see if there are any questions from online. Otherwise, we have a half-hour coffee break, and then we will continue with Heino Conrad. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'm very excited for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Heino Conrad from the Federal Forest Research Center. I think there's a longer title to it. Austrian Research and Training Center for Forests, which is one of our project collaborators. And we've been working together for a few years now. And he will tell us about how it is looking for the seed supply in Austria.
Thanks, Mario, for the introduction. the two previous talks, they were very scientific. I can present just data, but I hope it will still be interesting for you. Anyway, it's very important for the topic today. So the title of my talk is The Status Quo and the Future of the Forest Seed Supply in Austria. Of course, this is not my work alone. Many data are coming from our Federal Forest Office, where Stefanie Salzmann is working, and many of the modeling results I will show have been done by Silvio Schüller, who cannot be here today, unfortunately. So, yeah, I think we all know climate change is a fact in the Austrian forests. We have huge calamities with Norway spruce. Thousands of hectares have been deforested. Other species include Austrian pine, which is suffering both from drought, but especially from introduced pathogens, and other species which suffer very much, like for example, beech, which is directly affected by the climate change. As you know, the species distributions will change. So in this picture we have here the past, the current, and the possible future. So depicted for Norway spruce in Central Europe. As you can see on the left, the main part of Central Europe till 20 years ago was it was good to grow Norway spruce there. Now we are already in the +2 degrees scenario, so the range is much more contracted. And if we reach the 4 degrees scenario, then the range gets even more contracted. Anyway, in the Alpine region of Austria, we are still quite safe. But this is just the climate data. We don't know about bark beetle incidents in the future. This is also quite long known, which species will suffer most from climate change. This graph is from Hanewinkel from 2012. So the beech is will decline in area. Also Norway spruce, maybe for some surprising, also Scots pine will lose distribution area. The other species may remain more or less stable, but there is a strong increase predicted in the oak species, white oak, but also all the other oak species. They should be the winners of climate change. Climate change is not the only problem, or is one of the problems we have in the Austrian forest. About 20% of the Austrian forest at present lack the necessary regeneration. So these are 800,000 hectares. So what does this mean? Necessary regeneration is the idealized natural renewal of forest, and is estimated if the regeneration should be present on the site based on the age and the yield of the stand in question. So what does it mean? So this would be clear-cut area, forested sites, stands which have less than 20 years to the end harvest, gaps in protection forest, and of course the uneven age stands. So that means 20% of the forest are without regeneration, but though they should have regeneration. And alone, out of this 800,000 hectares, we have about 140,000 hectares which are situated in protective forests with direct protective function. So that means infrastructure is associated to this forest, and these 140,000 hectares are without regeneration. To reforest this area, only the 140,000 in the direct protective forest, we would need about 200 to 350 million plants. That's about 10 times the annual production of plants in the Austrian nursery sector. So, yeah, where should these plants come from? Of course, we have to work with natural regeneration. It's impossible to get these numbers just by planting. Just not possible. So, yeah, what is the situation? The Austrian forest is not adapted to climate change in many regions. The forest cover is, on the other hand, badly needed to mitigate the effects of climate change. We need to preserve the ecological and economic functions of the forest. We have climate change, but we also have a massive problem with browsing by game. So if this cannot be contained, we are in a bad spot. But this is known for many years. So as we see, the changes in the tree composition are unavoidable. We need the assisted migration also to add diversity to our forests to cope with climate change. So there will be a heavy impact on biodiversity, on the economy, but also on the culture associated to the forest. So, as said, we need an immense amount of reproductive material. Where should this come from? First, we have to look at some of the basics. It's not like you can go anywhere and plant any tree you want somewhere, but there is an Austrian Act on forest reproductive material. So this has a long history. The customer cannot see the genetic quality of the plants he buys. So that's why there are strict rules for the trade, for the harvest and for the trade of the reproductive material. This is all based on an EU directive and is implemented in national law. Yeah, here's the website. What we have to bear in mind is that there are 4 categories of forest reproductive material. This is the same for all member states of the European Union and the OECD countries as well. So we have the category source identified, which is the lowest category, let's say. So that means these stands have not been evaluated for vigor and quality, but therefore we don't know much about them. So this is only allowed in Austria for the so-called secondary tree species, so species which are not, which don't have such a high commercial value. Then we have the category selected, which are kind of the normal seed stands. So these seed stands are evaluated for vigor and quality by an BFW expert and then are appointed by the CRE. And this is then shown in the reference code. Sorry, I should have explained also here. So you have a reference code which denotes the species, the number of the stand, and then the provenance region and the elevational belt from which it was collected. The next higher category is qualified. So this is reproductive material collected from selected clones. This is, in Austria, this is basically, these are seed orchards, which are also appointed by the CRE. And this you can see in the reference for the harvest operation when there's a P, means plantage. So then it was from a seed orchard. The highest category would be tested. This depends on the performance of progeny tests for the selected clones. So far, this is not applied in Austria. Yeah, what material do we have? So for all seed stands, for all seed orchards, there's a national register where the database of the stands. So we have 4,575 certified seed stands, which is quite a lot for a small country like Austria. And then we also have 71 seed orchard, certified seed orchards by law, plus 9 others for tree species which are not covered by the law. just for your information. I will not go into more detail. And then we have also 82 poplar stool beds, which are used for vegetative propagation. Also not covered today. So where are those seed stands located in Austria? As you can see below, here down we have the provenance regions, which are shown here on the map. So this is the map of the provenance regions of Austria. As you can see, the distribution is not even, but it's in a way logic. So the regions, the 4.1 and 4.2, they have the most stands because they are also the largest and they have a large forest cover. For example, 7.2 is in agricultural area, less forest. So that's okay. When we take a look on the species coverage by the seed stands, you see that almost half of them are just Norway spruce, 1,000, about 900 are large, 500 fir, and then as the first broadleaf species comes beech. So what we can see here is that this has historically grown. These are not the winners we need after climate change. These are the old species which have been used for a long time. So, but all the other tree species, the many we have, they are covered by much less seed stands. Yeah, maybe I should go back. Just bear in mind this provenance region map, this pattern, is very important for the practical afforestation. So this, based on this, are the subsidies which are given to the forest owners to reforest their forest. Okay. Yeah, so during this period of about 10 years, there have been 1,800 harvest operations in 23 tree species. Just to show you what has been harvested. Interesting is that already in this period, silver fir was the most harvested species. Then comes spruce, larch, and then the two most important broadleaves at the moment, pedunculate oak and sycamore maple. What's also is interesting to show is that how often the seed stands have been harvested. This varies among species as well. So we have about 2,000 stands of Norway spruce, but actually only 240 have been harvested during the last 10 years. And in 280 harvest operations. So this means each stand has only been harvested once. Like in pedunculate oak, sorry, it's in German, so Quercus robur, we have only 100 seed stands, of which like 60 have been harvested, but 200 harvest operations. So these seed stands are used much more regularly. As I've said, we have seed orchards and seed stands. This figure should show you the importance of the orchards, but also the fluctuation, the harvest numbers between the years. So there are stand-forming species like beech, where we don't have any orchards, so there is no influence of orchards. In spruce, the orchard importance is just coming. 2-3 registered seed orchards. But there are some species where it's very difficult to collect the material in the forest, and like black elder, larch, or Scots pine, cherry, where the seed orchards have a very high importance. And in general, the pattern is that the importance of the seed orchards is increasing because they can be managed and then they produce more regularly the seeds. We're talking about seeds, but I have to show the demand. I have to switch to plants a little bit. So here I want to show to which degree the Austrian market can be covered by Austrian material. So in the main tree species, there's not such a big problem. We have very well covered the main tree species. Of course, the white is the foreign material. Of course, Douglas fir is coming still from the US. So there is most material coming from outside of Austria. But it's kind of surprising that we don't have enough beech or cherry in Austria. When we come to the secondary tree species, we are well covered only for the Austrian pine and the stone pine, because these species are not so important in the neighboring countries. But all the rest of the material is mainly coming from outside of Austria, particularly this Norway maple and birch. It's quite surprising. But yeah, this is basically due that the demand has not been very high in these species. So the nurseries just buy what they need from abroad, less work. But yeah, we have to bear this in mind. So again, current trends in the plant sales, which are already quite nicely reflecting the changes happening in the forest. So in the graph goes until, unfortunately, only 2018, but the numbers I have until recently. So Norway spruce was about almost 20 million plants, but it has now dropped to minus 50 by minus, so it's less than 10 million by now. So it has dropped by 50%, which is a so we need to large there, but spruce is really going down. The silver fir has increased by threefold almost. Here we have a kind of a problem that we need more foreign material than anticipated. Douglas fir also has stabilized. Scots pine is also more or less stable. There was a jump in pedunculate oak, but also in sessile oak. So now we're talking about 1.2 million plants of pedunculate oak sold annually, and while we started, this is this line, so we started at 300,000, yeah, in 10 years ago. So this is like, yeah, much more actually than 400%. So yeah, so the climate change is catching on faster than we think. Yeah, basically that's, yeah. But of course we have the problems in this seed procurement. The masting behavior is strongly influenced by climate change. This is the graph shown for Norway spruce, I think. So in the, let's say in the old days, there were fewer harvests, but then strong harvests. The harvests have increased over the last 20 years, but the quality of the seeds collected is going down. This is probably due to weather extremes during the seed ripening. This is most evident in silver fir, which has dropped by almost half in the germination capacity. We also have associated problems with the harvest logistics and the cleaning of the seeds. So there's missing stuff, there's missing infrastructure. Big problem is new pests and diseases. The bad news is for the oak, we have the oak lacebug introduced from eastern North America, which has found nice habitat in southeastern Europe. It has reached now also Austria and the southeast, and it has a devastating effect on the seed production in the oaks. So this is a big problem if this increases in the future. But there are also Leptoglossus occidentalis, also from North America. It's damaging cones of conifers all over Europe. yeah, one problem is also the handling of the seeds, the ability to store the seeds. So conifers are easily stored, while for broadleaves the storage time is much shorter. And there's also kind of a lack of know-how in the nurseries on the seed pre-treatment to be more efficient. Yes, and the other problem is that we have low productivity and overage in the seed orchards. I already come to the solutions we discussed yesterday also. We need to manage, so we need to optimize the harvest, seed processing, and the storage in the seed stands. So we should better manage the seed stands for seed production. We need to invest in the infrastructure, as said. We need processing and storage, more processing and storage capacity. We need more seed stands for the secondary tree species, which are getting more importance. And so we should use the harvest possibilities whenever possible, especially also to avoid dependency on the forest foreign material. So this can quickly erode, like we see in oak now, for example, from Hungary. We also need to optimize management of the seed orchards. We need to have optimized fertilization and plant protection measures there to have this continuous harvest that were anticipated when we installed the seed orchards. Therefore, we need this improved understanding of the connection of the fruit set and the nutrients and the water availability. And we need to rejuvenate some of the old orchards and install new ones for this lacking species. This is part also of the forestry project that also has kind of enabled this meeting today here. So yeah, we are working on it. Further solutions are to improve the efficiency in the plant production in nurseries. We need to have improved pre-treatment, so to get more plants out of 1 kilo of seeds, we need to invest in the efficiency in the plant production. And we need to strengthen overall the nursery sector. We have had many interactions with the nurseries. A big problem is that customers do not accept the plants they have ordered. They don't pick them up and they don't pay them. The nursery has to throw them away, mostly for logistic reasons. Then we need clear recommendations for the suitable provenances, because this is a problem associated to the subsidies. You don't get the subsidies if you don't have the proper provenance. If the provenance is not available, what should you do? And we need to improve the planning for the nurseries by long-term contracts with the customers, but also, if possible, by pre-orders in time. And the main thing is that we have to communicate with the stakeholders. That was a quite active workshop yesterday, so I think this is a key thing we have to do. Then just a few words about non-native tree species, which are kind of have been brought up as a solution to the whole problem. But we must bear in mind that for many tree species, we don't know how they really will perform here in Europe. And they are also affected by climate change. It's not like that they must do better. So, and we have a high number of broadleaf species available, no problem there. But the list of the conifers is much shorter. But the conifers are badly needed by the industry, by the sawmills. Austria is the 5th biggest exporter of sawmill products, sawn wood. So a lot of jobs depend on this. Next question, what about the genetic diversity of these provenances we are using from the new tree species? Not much is known about this. Where's the material coming from? what about the access and benefit sharing and the requirements by the Convention on Biological Diversity? We have to kind of also let the countries where this material is coming from benefit. They will not give this for free anymore. And then, of course, is the material really available? No? Because also in these areas, climate change is increasing. And for example, in North Africa, each year, hundreds of hectares of Cedrus atlantica are dying because of climate change. So these areas are also affected by climate change. So there is no guarantee that we can rely on the import of this material. Even Douglas fir in Pacific Northwest is under heavy stress from drought. Just a graph showing the view of the tree species. Yeah, Douglas fir doing well under our current 2+2 scenario, but what happens at +4? Less area covered. Same goes for red oak and Abies grandis. Some would do quite well under the 4 degrees scenario, like black walnut or the black locust. But do we really want this one? I don't know. And the other extreme would be to go for species like Monterey pine, which would do fine under the +4 scenario, but with unknown risks if it really would. Yeah, now it wouldn't survive. I'm bad in time, no? Okay, so just a few words about our current research. So basically we are focusing on species and provenances of the native species. So we are following the assisted migration approach. So currently we are looking for Norway spruce, white oaks, sycamore maple from southeastern Europe. Almost too late because there is a problem with drought. Seed production is not working there anymore also. And we are also looking for these sorbus species, for example, which have been projected to do better in the future. Just some words, some advertisement for a new project. It's called OptForest, the Horizon Europe project, a research and innovation action which tackles all the problems from provenance selection to silviculture, breeding in the forest, but especially the one work package which I'm leading is on the provision of the adequate reproductive material for the future forest, where we also do modeling. We work with the nurseries and we also do the modeling of the demand in the future. So, and with this, I just thank our donors, which is very important. and thanks to you for listening. And maybe one short question. Okay.
Thank you so much, Heino, for providing a human perspective again. You know, make the problem, every problem is somebody's problem. And you can see how from the biology to the application in our forests, this is truly the case. One short question from Davide, please.
Thank you very much. Very impressive, this infrastructure you have been implementing. And one question related to the stands in which you collect seeds. Do you have a dedicated silvicultural model? So how do you do forest management in this site? So for example, if you have some optimal basal area you want to get by species and 3 crown spacings to increase the seed production? And do you instrument this forest like with dendrometers and weather station?
Sorry, the last part, I think.
If you instrument the stands with like tools like dendrometers or weather station?
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, this is we were heavily discussing this issue yesterday in the workshop. Actually, these seed stands are not really managed for seed production. That's a big problem, and they are also not monitored for growth and so on. So it's the expert goes there, checks them out if they are okay, but after that, basically nothing is done. But that's what we have discussed yesterday, that we need to do management there, bigger crowns, yeah, to have more harvest from the good trees. Get rid of the bad ones, and the vigorous at least.
Yeah, and we noticed that there's a real disconnect between the forest owners and the people that harvest them for seeds. That was one of the big insights of yesterday's workshop, and that's a lever that we can hopefully in the future work on. Right. Thank you so much, Heino, for your insights.